Hey everyone, welcome back. In today's tutorial we'll be diving into the disassembly and cleaning process of the EGR and intake manifold of this D5 engine. Even though these 5-cylinder engines aren't as prone to carbon buildup as some of the newer models, being diesel engines, they still need occasional cleaning to keep them running smooth for longer. The job might be a bit long and tedious, but if you follow the steps, you shouldn't have any issues completing it. We start off with disconnecting the battery terminals and the MAF sensor. Next, we loosen the filter hose clamp and remove some of the air inlet components. The filter housing is held on a rubber mount and a clip position at the bottom of it. To avoid breaking the clip, you need to remove the filter and push it from the inside. We can remove the battery now and the 4 nuts holding the battery tray in place. Part 1 of the video is the injector removal. In the following video the procedure will be summarized, but there is a separate detailed version of the job which you can access by clicking on the link showing up on one of the corners of the screen. To remove the injectors I've used 70mm wrench. Volvo has a special instrument for this purpose which more or less I think is just a standard common biofuel lines wrench, but unless you're doing this for a living it's not really worth spending the money for it. You're going to find that removing the inlet pipe will open space for removing the fuel lines on the bottom side. You need to also disconnect the PCV heated nipple. Be gentle when you're pulling it off because you can easily snap the elbow connection on the inlet pipe side. This happened to this vehicle before, so the elbow connection has been replaced with modified metal version. The bottom end of the fuel lines is removed with 14mm spanner. Next, we have to remove the return fuel lines. The trick here is to release the lock by rotating the cap anti-clockwise, then you pull it up and it's done. Finally, we unscrew the bolts holding the injectors with 8mm socket. To extract the injectors, we're gonna use a universal hammer tool. although here it wasn't really needed as the injectors were loose enough. Moving on to the EGR removal and cleaning. This is where things start to get dirty. So the first thing we have to do is remove the wiring duct. This is held on 3 screws, 2 placed on the side and 1 at the front. Next, we loosen the hose clamp as we want to disconnect the hose between the EGR and intake manifold. We also disconnect a few of the sensor plugs staying on the way. This car is normally driven on long journeys, so carbon buildup is not excessive. Before removing the EGR, we need to drain the coolant. As shown in the picture, this could be done by opening the drain valve on the radiator and by unplugging the coolant hose from the engine oil cooler. There will still be some fluid left in the pipes and the EGR later, but it certainly won't cause as much mess and it's a good reason to change your coolant later. Next, we need to remove the charge pipe between the throttle body and the nipple connected after the intercooler. There's 2 clamps which need to be loosened. The hose is disconnected now, as well as the electrical plug for the throttle body. What I'm trying to show as the next action is that we need to disconnect the coolant pipes on the EGR. Followed by that is the exhaust pipe, which is really hard to access. This pipe is held by 2 bolts, but they are very tight and the access is very restricted. Therefore, we had to do additional disassembling, which wasn't part of the Volvo's instructions. Firstly, we had to remove the battery bracket and some of the coolant hoses connecting to the engine block. They're literally staying on the way, so you're gonna see them. Once bracket is removed, this opens enough space to work. We also had to remove the metal tray between the engine and the cabin. Follow the video to see the installation later. So now we have access to the exhaust pipe and can remove the two bolts. We can now proceed to removing the EGR. There are two bolts at the front and one at the side, which is T40 Torx. So the EGR is finally out. A quick look at the condition of it. Something to highlight here, an interesting design on the coolant feed at the back of the EGR. There's a metal pipe which connects directly on the coolant feed port on the EGR, and there is only an O-ring and a bit of a silicone used to seal it, which interestingly seems to be working. The EGR is now taken apart and we can see the valve. Again, it's dirty but could be worse. This is the coolant port at the back of the EGR. You can see the leftover from the sealant. This needs to be cleaned and reapplied when EGR is put back together. So now, after we've cleaned everything with acetone and a greaser, we can start putting things back together. So what we're seeing here is the EGR cooler bypass valve, which underwent a small modification. The valve is operated with vacuum actuator with a plastic arm. Due to friction, the plastic lever slips out and can no longer control the cooler valve. After this modification, I doubt it will slip out again. So we're going to replace all the gaskets, and the one which will be reused, we'll apply some high temperature sealant. Part numbers of the gaskets will be available in the video description. The EGR cooler is torqued to 70 Nm. New gasket for the throttle body, and we torque it to 10 Nm. Lastly, we need to reapply some sealant at the coolant port at the back of the EGR. Be careful with the amount of sealant, as we don't want any of it to go into the coolant system. We put some sealant on the pipe as well. EGR is now assembled and ready to be installed. EGR is now installed. We want to torque the front two bolts to 50 Nm and the one on the side to 24 Nm. The exhaust pipe needs to be torqued to 24 Newton meters. We can mount back the battery bracket and connect all of the coolant hoses. Follow the process to see the extra parts we had to disassemble earlier. You can use the opportunity to isolate better some of the wiring looms. Part 3. Intake manifold / valve cover removal and cleaning. There are 70 bolts which have to be unscrewed before being able to remove the manifold. Additionally, the vacuum hoses, the oil cap and the engine lifting bracket needs to be removed. The bracket is needed in order to access the screw behind it. Bolts were coming out with different sizes, so make a note of their location. You may find that the manifold gasket has stuck to the head, so we want to try to separate them. Intake manifold is now removed, so we can give it a good clean. Now as the inlet valve is exposed, you spend the time to clean them. We've shown this procedure in another video, but generally the idea is that you need to crank the engine manually to ensure each valve is closed before cleaning, as we don't want any of the crap to get into the engine. You can use endoscope to verify valve's position. New rubber gasket for the intake manifold. We torqued the manifold to 10 Newton meters. There was no specified tightening pattern by Volvo in the installation instructions, but generally the advice is to either start doing them from the middle towards the ends in X pattern or do them from one end to the other. In the last part of the video, we install back the injectors with new gaskets and bolts. This will be a shorter version of the job. For the full procedure, click on the pop-up link to watch the complete injectors video. The injectors are now in place and we can torque them to 18 Newton meters. We're also putting back the fuel lines and torque them to the values advised by Volvo. Engine is back together, we filled up the necessary amount of coolant and we can finally try to start the engine. Bear in mind that now as the fuel lines are empty, the engine will be cracking for a while before it starts. Don't worry, this is normal.
A few moments later.
When the engine starts, you can try keeping the revs at about 2000 rpm so that to speed up the air bleeding process out of the fuel lines. So there we go, engine has started, no leaks were observed, so we can tick the job as done. Thank you for watching, like and subscribe for more tutorials and we'll see you next time.